The treasury intendant did not sleep the night before the coronation. Not from nerves, because the crown, the actual physical crown meant to sit on Louis XVI's head in 12 hours, was locked in a goldsmith's strongbox across town, and the goldsmith was not releasing it without fresh ink on a promissory note. So at dawn the intendant walked through the cold June streets of Reims, loan document in hand, and stood in front of a moneylender's counter while a clerk weighed the sacred objects like collateral at a pawnbroker's. Which they were. The king's man signed. The goldsmith handed over the jewels, and a few hours later, in the cathedral packed with velvet and incense, the archbishop lowered that same crown onto a 20-year-old king and called him God's anointed. The year was 1775. The state Louis inherited was already 2 billion livres in debt, and this was the first big decision of the new reign. Throw a party that screamed invincibility, with money the treasury did not have. One man inside the palace understood the arithmetic before the incense had cleared. His name was Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, the Controller General of Finances, and he was the kind of person who looked at a gilded carriage and saw 12% compound interest. Turgot ran the numbers for the full medieval ceremony at Reims, the ancient vestments, the sacred oil, the banquet with 2,000 birds, the traditional gifts to the cathedral chapter, and then he made a proposal that, in the financial language of the court, sounded like treason. Scale it down. Hold the coronation in Paris. Save the money. Signal to every creditor watching that the new reign was serious about not going broke. The court said no. Not because the court was evil. Because the court was playing a 1640s operating system on a 1770s balance sheet. In the universe of Louis XIV, a coronation was not a party. It was the ritual that transformed a mortal into a king. The sacred oil, the touching of the sick, the ancient robes. This was not decoration. This was the political software. If you skipped it or trimmed it, you were telling the nobility, the church, the ambassadors, the public, and your own tax collectors that you were not quite a real king. And if you were not quite a real king, your creditors might panic anyway. So the expensive ceremony was, in a twisted way, the cheaper disaster. Spend millions to look solvent, or admit you are not solvent and watch the loans dry up overnight. Turgot lost, and watching him lose is like watching someone explain the fire code to a room full of people holding lit matches and velvet curtains. He pointed at the numbers. The court pointed at tradition. The crown pointed at Reims. On June 11, 1775, Louis XVI was crowned in full medieval splendor. The crowd cheered. The ambassadors bowed. The king touched the sick, and the people believed. 400 kilometers away, in Geneva, a banker read the news and recalculated the monarchy's risk premium. This is where the economics stops being a footnote and starts driving the wagon off the cliff. The ceremony was a costly signal. In a world where you cannot easily prove you are strong, you do something so expensive that a weak person could never afford it. Everyone watching concludes you must be strong. A truly bankrupt kingdom would not throw a multi-million livre spectacle. Therefore, France must not be truly bankrupt. The logic is tidy, almost beautiful, like a cathedral vault. The problem is the signal only works if the audience cannot see the loan documents. The peasants cheering along the procession route could not see them. Most foreign ambassadors could not see them. But the Genevan bankers, the Dutch lenders, and the fermiers généraux? They had copies. They knew exactly where the coronation money came from. Short-term advances at 10 to 12% interest from the very tax farmers who had grown rich squeezing the French taxpayer. The ambassadors saw power. The bankers saw a 12% risk premium printed right on the receipt. Only one of those groups was lending more money. The signal meant to shout, "Strength," whispered risk to every person who set the interest rate. The expensive ceremony was not the opposite of bankruptcy. It was the costume bankruptcy wears to a job interview. The ceremony ended. The bills landed. And then the bill began its long, quiet journey through the French tax system, down to people who never saw the inside of Reims Cathedral. The treasury had fronted the cash using loans from the Fermiers Généraux, a private consortium that had bought the right to collect royal taxes and made their profit by squeezing more out of the taxpayer than they forwarded to the crown. To recoup the coronation advance, they leaned on indirect taxes, and the most reliable of those was the Gabelle, the salt tax. Under the Gabelle, every person in most parts of France above the age of 8 was required to buy a fixed amount of salt each year at a royal monopoly price. Salt is not optional. The poor felt every coin. A peasant family buying their mandatory salt in 1776 paid a fraction of a sou that eventually became debt service on the loan that funded the coronation banquet. The banquet featured 2,000 birds. The accounting for the banquet featured 0 birds and a stack of promissory notes. The birds existed. The money to pay for the birds existed only as future salt, collected from millions of people who, if they saw a crown at all, saw it on a coin that was already leaving their hands. Turgot tried to break the cycle before it calcified. He proposed real reforms: free the grain trade, abolish guilds that strangled competition, slash court expenses, and most of all, stop the bleeding. His reward was a wall of furious resistance from every group that feasted on the current mess. The court with its pensions, the tax farmers with their monopolies, the parliaments with their power to block new taxes. Turgot was dismissed in May 1776, less than a year after the coronation. Being correct was not a job skill in 18th century France. He walked away, and the spending accelerated into something that would make the coronation bill look like a rounding error. In 1778, France entered the American Revolutionary War. Full-scale naval and land war against Britain, fought across the Atlantic, cost the treasury roughly 1.3 billion additional livres. The strategic logic had a certain sense. Weaken Britain, restore prestige, avenge the 7 Years' War. The financial logic was catastrophic. France borrowed the war money on top of the coronation debt, on top of the inherited debt, on top of the court's permanent overspending, all rolled into ever larger loan packages at ever higher interest rates. The coronation debt vanished as a distinct line item. It melted into the general pile of government obligations. But the interest kept compounding. The crown had invested so heavily in projecting strength that reversing course became politically impossible. Cutting spending would imply the coronation was a lie. Admitting weakness would trigger the very creditor panic the ceremony was meant to prevent. So the crown borrowed more to look strong enough to borrow more. Each loan justified the last. The staircase of IOU notes grew higher, and the man climbing it had a crown slipping off his head. By 1781, the new finance minister Jacques Necker knew the numbers needed help. He published the Compte Rendu au Roi, the first public statement of French state finances. It showed a manageable deficit, perhaps a small surplus in ordinary accounts. The public celebrated. Creditors relaxed. France was fine. The Compte Rendu was not a lie. It was a carefully edited selection of truths, built to make the next loan possible. Necker had excluded the extraordinary war expenses. He had massaged the interest payments. The report showed you a kingdom. A banker should have seen a marketing brochure. The coronation debt, now buried under years of compound interest and accounting tricks, was invisible to anyone who could not read between the lines. And the lines were printed very far apart. For a few years, the trick held. France kept borrowing. The American War ended, and the debt kept growing. By 1787, the crown hit the wall. It could not borrow more without new taxes, and it could not impose new taxes without approval from the Assembly of Notables. The Assembly was convened. The Crown asked for money. The Assembly said, "Show us the real books." The real books did not make pleasant reading. The Assembly refused the new taxes. The Crown was trapped. The Estates General, a medieval body that had not met since 1614, was summoned for 1789, and at that moment, the hidden coronation receipt, the war loans, the tax farmer advances, the creative accounting, and the compound interest all landed on the same table at the same time, in front of representatives who wanted answers. 14 years after the bells rang at Reims, the bill walked into the room and ate the monarchy. Let me be exact about what the coronation was and was not. It was not the cause of the French Revolution. The American War cost roughly 400 times more. The tax system had been broken for a century. The institutional rot was structural, not personal. But the coronation of 1775 is a perfectly preserved fossil of the decision-making that made those structural problems fatal. It was a discretionary prestige expense at the exact moment austerity was the only credible signal that could have restored confidence. The court chose the wrong signal. The creditors raised the rate. The bill was passed down to people who could not read it. The tax farmers who lent the money, some went to the guillotine later, including the chemist Lavoisier, who had the misfortune to be both a genius and a fermier général. The people who paid the salt tax? They never got a receipt for the coronation banquet. They got a revolution instead. The crown jewels that spent the night before the ceremony in a pawn shop? They kept moving in and out of moneylenders' vaults for years, until the revolution nationalized them and locked them in a museum, where they became public property. The ultimate creditor took possession. But I keep coming back to a different image. Not the king in splendor. Not the crowd cheering. I see the treasury intendant in Reims, early morning, June 11, 1775. He has just locked the empty cash box, the one that was supposed to hold the ceremonial funds. The lid is closed. He blows out the candle on the counting table. Outside the bells are ringing. The procession is moving toward the cathedral. The crown is glinting in the sun. And the intendant walks away from an empty room because there is nothing left to guard. The ceremony cost millions. The cash box was empty before the first note sounded. The crown was a sacred object. It also spent a lot of Tuesday nights at the pawnbrokers. And when the revolution finally came, nobody was surprised except the people who had been watching the ceremony instead of reading the receipts.